Whimsicraft is an aesthetic that flourished from the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s that is composed of saturated colors, heavy patterns, and handmade goods. It describes things you would see at an art fair in 1994, and it is the aesthetic of the fun, quirky, artsy ant character in 90s media. The aesthetic was first identified by Evan Collins, one of the founding members of the Consumer Aesthetics Research Institute, who is our guest for today's episode.
Thanks. Yeah. Hey there. Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's crazy to have you on the pod. You know, I've always looked up to you. We've done episodes on McBling and Y2K futurism, so it's crazy that this is happening.
Yeah,
thanks. Yeah, I'm excited to be here. I'm always excited to talk about this. It's just tons of fun. I don't get a lot of opportunities to actually discuss it in depth. Nice. Yeah, so it's cool.
Yeah, so we're going to start out with a bit of an interview to introduce you to our audience. So the first question I want to ask is, can you start by telling us a bit about your background? I know that you have a background in architecture, and are you still a practicing architect?
So yes, I'm still working in architecture, interior design. I've been doing so for about a decade now, mainly in a commercial, office and things like that. Still work in architecture, trained in architecture with a tiny bit of art history thrown in there for my background. Yeah.
All right. So can you tell us a little bit about the founding and the start of the Consumer Aesthetics Research Institute?
For sure. So back in the early 2010s, I used to be really interested in the vaporwave music and sort of visual art scene that was emerging at the time. I had kind of got very involved with it. I had a lot of kind of trying to, connect with that scene. And I felt like when it was emerging, there was just this light bulb turned on for me because I was seeing something and experiencing all these people that were also interested in what we call kind of consumer detritus or something like that, the leftovers of consumer culture and smooth jazz and elevator music and stuff like that, and just these things that people typically throw away and don't pay any attention to.
We're not meant to be preserved and studied and remembered, and that's why it's more thrilling to study it.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of what I found super fascinating about it, and the fact that other people were interested in it was just very exciting to me, because I'd always had an interest in not originally consumer culture specifically, but design movements, recent design. It always fascinated me that recent design hadn't really been investigated. It's I remember in art history and architecture classes, sometimes it felt like they would just stop at 1980 or something like that. Or they just be it was just postmodernism. Sure, whatever. Then postmodernism happened and that, we don't know, who cares? And there was some star architects or something like that. I'd always been interested in futurism, and kind of specifically the futurism that had really existed around the time of my formative years, around the late 90s and early 2000s, which we'd kind of later term as Y2K aesthetic or Y2K futurism. And so I had that kind of interest in the background, and it always just kind of floated around, back there. But it took a backseat to my interest in just, primarily, specifically architecture. Kind of what had been sort of drilled in at college at the time was, develop your personal style, become a huge star architect or something like that, be the next
find your
Zaha.
thing, and then
So it's kind of, I had focused so much on that all the way up until finishing grad school in 2014 that after that happened, I was pretty much aimless. I graduated. I remember I had a choice to
ennui.
Yeah,
post grad ennui.
I was like, "What am I doing?" Because I had finished up my senior project and I had kind of just tanked it. It was well, I mean, it's tank it as much as you can to kind of just let everybody go in Columbia. That's where I went to grad school. But the thing is that I had realized first I wasn't as interested in what I was doing at the time was this very techno computational architecture, involving a lot of math and science and
generative design, blob architecture kind of stuff.
Exactly. And I'm not that great at math, so it was a struggle. I was I'm really pushing something that I don't think, maybe I'm going down the wrong path here.
And so you taught yourself though.
I did pretty, I made through some of it, but so after I graduated, I was just well, I don't really know what I'm doing. So I followed my family to Oregon, just kind of stayed with them for a couple of months, that summer. And I basically just decided I'm just going to see what takes, what I'm interested in. And I'm just going to spend all my time on it, all day, every day, and just see what I gravitate towards. And being involved in that vaporwave scene at the time, and kind of after a failed project, I had tried to do a vaporwave concert in a real dying mall, and it was a total disaster.
Oh man.
I was kind of shocked. I had no idea. So yeah, just basically, if you want to do a vaporwave concert at the time, don't put it in a physical space because that will cause a
interesting.
Yeah, they had a rift developed between vaporwave stays online or vaporwave in a real physical space.
That's so interesting. It kind of reminds us. We did an episode about Electroclash, and there was a guy who actually organized the first Electroclash festival and put the name on it, and he got a lot of flack and hate from people in the scene. Their bit was more like, no, you can't put a name on it. No, you can't box us into the genre and all that.
Yeah, that's a very common thing.
Yeah, I mean, hurting creatives is a famously hard thing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So, basically, I got very interested in kind of finding out what was this idea of a vaporwave for the late '90s and early 2000s. I spent a lot of time collecting images. I collected like 800 images, 890 images, and posted it to the subreddit. It gained some traction. People were like, "Wow, okay."
Wait, I've thumbed through those. That was on Imgur, right?
Yeah,
Posted on that. Yeah, no, I just like sat around with friends on Discord and we looked at every image once.
Oh my god. Okay.
Yeah, that was forever ago. I'm trying to think when that was.
Yeah, it was 2014. It was like. I don't know if you looked at it back when it was originally.
No, this was
wow.
I mean, that was my last year in Las Vegas. Yeah,
I wonder how much that traveled, or I don't know.
It was an amazing link. Yeah, a lot of album covers and stuff.
Yeah. I spent so much time. I was like really too into it.
I never saw your Reddit, but I was a member of your Facebook group, Y2K Futurism.
Yeah. That was back in Facebook.
That must have been 2015, 2016.
Yeah, that's exactly. I wasn't like super growing, and active. But yeah, so basically it started out on Reddit, and then, it was gaining traction. People were very interested in like, oh, why don't you pursue this further? And, see where this goes. And so someone suggested create a Facebook group, which at the time, Facebook was a lot better for that. I feel like Facebook is quite dead for any sort of
community building.
Exactly. It's like non-existent now. But at the time, there was like this thing called like Weird Facebook.
Oh yeah,
which I
was on it.
Yeah, I kind of liked. There was a lot of actually, and what I consider proto CARI groups were on there that I think that's where some of the members were drawn from. They were not really organized around studying like recent design history. Instead, they were organized around like design typology, or basically like they'd be called like corporate aesthetics or hospital aesthetics or like beauty shop aesthetic, like some weird like. It was just very interesting, and that I think inspired me a little bit to pursue creating these different groups for history instead, and attracted some members from those groups.
Was Cool Freaks Wikipedia Club part of that?
I remember that.
I feel like
people
the people
came from that.
Yeah, I'm sure they came from it. But I don't know if that would be considered weird Facebook. I kind of feel like it might.
Yeah. I think it's in that extended universe.
I feel like there's a lot I'm sorry. It's like a tangent because I'd have to go and dig through them. There was like one of them that my friends were really into called Thank Mr. Banky. This one
it was to make fun of artwork that was derivative of Banksy style.
Yeah. Wow, Banky.
Like the I'm 14 and this is deep sort of thing going on. Like, oh yeah, wow. But so it attracted a lot of really interesting people, and I was just surprised at the time that so many like, I don't know, cool artsy people were on Facebook as well. Yeah.
I think that it's kind of like the mall thing where like Facebook is the most banal and just average place. And so because it's like has no pretensions around it, then anything you create in there is like going to be interesting, I feel. Yeah,
it did have like an absolute, like a really, really wide variety of people that could just find these like all over, like you just kind of collect together in this space.
So I imagine at some point you started to bristle against the format of Facebook.
Yeah, we were getting like flagged for all sorts of things, just posting like, an artsy image that's like too racy or something like that, or too like, if it's like that, or the groups were getting somewhat unmanageable. They're like trolls kind of getting into there, and we were getting a bit overtaxed and overextended with trying to manage because CARI kind of evolved very organically. Basically, what would happen is someone would post something to a particular group, like let's say like they'd post something to Y2K, and then like everybody would like jump in and be like, no, that's not Y2K, that's not Y2K, that's not Y2K, and the person would be like, well, what is it? And they're like, why don't you make a new group? I'm like, okay, so they'd make a new group, and then the other person would post something in their group, and they'd be like, no, that doesn't fit there, make a new group. So I would have to make like a graph of it. But it started
organizational flowchart. Oh my god, that's not why you got into this.
No, I know. Well, that was what got so interesting because I'm like at the time I can be like a very hyper fixated focused person where I get really deeply involved into something like Y2K. And I just want to find every possible example of it. So I would go to the library, and this time back then I lived in Seattle, and I would go to the library after work, which was like 3 blocks away from me. And to anybody who's visiting Seattle, I don't know, and interested in this stuff, they have the most incredible magazine collection I've ever found. And it's just open to go peruse. So I would just dig through, they have like every, interior design magazine, every like fashion, like anything you could find. And so I would just go through and dig through them and be like, wait, at the time I was very focused on Y2K. So I'd go through all these old design magazines from the 90s. And what would happen is I'd be like, where's the Y2K? Where's the Y2K? I can't find anything. What is all this stuff? Like, and I kept finding all the...
just toss it aside.
I was like, what is this stuff? And it was basically everything at the time. All of those magazines are filled with basically Global Village Coffee House and what we call Fraser Bain.
Fraser Bain.
And corporate grunge, basically.
Yeah.
So I would get very frustrated.
And I'm sure you thumbed through some Whimsicraft.
I did. I wouldn't know. Yeah, I wouldn't even know what to like have called it at the time or what to put it in under, but I tried to like open my mind to being more open, like to digging through more of these magazines and trying to scan and share things that I personally did not find like interesting or appealing.
That's hard to balance. You need a little bit of monomania to like get to the bottom of an aesthetic. But it's like, I don't know, you can't be looking for every aesthetic at all times. You gotta
that's it.
How many aesthetics has CARI identified at this point? Do you keep like a count?
On the official CARI.institute website, we have, I believe, like 30 something, I think, on there.
It's more
30,
than that.
I feel like 42.
Because there's 5 pages. Each page, I think there's at least 20 on it. So it's close to 100.
Really?
Wow. I didn't realize there was that many. The thing is, we have... Like I lost track because we have that front facing, like it's like our public facing site, which is our core CARI site. That is basically where we put the aesthetics once we've kind of polished them and made sure that we've kind of vetted them a little bit more.
Yeah.
And then I have my personal arena page where I have like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of investigations.
So that's kind of people can just see your work in progress boards there.
Yeah, exactly. So I call some of them work in progress and try. Yeah, they're basically. They're basically the placeholders, and they're not ready to go on our website because they need to really be more vetted by kind of our internal kind of CARI community before they can really be determined to be legitimate or something like that. No. But that's kind of how it works.
It's so interesting. Like the stuff you study is so recent. So a lot of like strict academics would turn their nose up at it of just like there hasn't been enough time. And so instead you have this very like dedicated crew of people who are applying a little bit more professionalism, but still coming at it from a kind of nicely amateur angle, I think.
Yeah, and that still kind of surprises me because it's when we started this work, I kind of expected that there would be some sort of like, or that there would be a lot more like academic institutions or like a government apparatus company, like something that an art institute thing, they would be already on top of this and kind of have delved into it quite a bit, but it doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, it seems to be that there's, again, that kind of issue with what's considered worthy of being studied, like higher art versus this kind of, lowbrow commercial art, whether it's like kind of worthy of this much investigation, which we obviously believe it is. Yeah.
And I think it's good you're doing it now as opposed to leaving this to people later because you're actively preserving materials that might get lost to time otherwise. Because you've been described as being a design archivist, which I think is a really fitting title.
Yeah. Yeah, we take that very seriously because that's kind of one of my biggest like worries and that I have with design preservation from this time period and, from the 1970s really and even really continuing now is just how little emphasis there is on and retaining materials and really properly archiving commercial materials like catalogs, even, sales catalogs of things like that people just, toss out, after they're, not interested in them. But now they're really, really valuable, we believe, for kind of understanding our own recent, culture, which is very, heavily, consumer centric.
Because your organization, it focuses on physical, largely print media. And it seems like you're not quite ready to start identifying consumer aesthetics that emerged during the digital era. You're kind of holding off on that, it seems, right?
We do have kind of how it works is that we have different members of the organization that focus on different eras and consumer sort of eras.
Yeah, do you have departments forming?
In a way, yeah, we do have, it's very, department. We have got 3 people that are like, I find this interesting, and I'm going to go to the 2010s basically. So they work kind of more on the 2010s, and they'll kind of search websites and print media still exists. So they'll kind of find their own print examples and scan them. I kind of focus more on the 70s to basically to 2010. I kind of stopped right around the Great Recession, because that's an interesting huge turning point in consumer design. I found is a huge shift. That's basically when a lot of things stopped and online culture really sort of started with social media and everything. And
a lot of things change. So I wanted to ask you this: what's the most recent aesthetic to be identified? It can be either it was posted to the CARI site or something internal where you're like, wow, I just noticed this, we're hitting gold.
There's a couple. One is more of a motif, but I do find it particularly fascinating that we don't really deal with it very much. We call it 50s suburbia advert kitsch or parody. It is I know on Nickelodeon or there's a bubble tape commercial from the 90s. It's any commercial or that commercial. It happened a lot in kids media.
Yeah, in the 90s and 2000s, where they were playing off of the tropes of 50s suburbia and perfection, but then doing something a little they have
sneaky
with it.
The lunch lady with cat's eye glasses or something like that. Or the suburban family sitting around at one of those old timey TVs or something like that. And I just find that kind of just particularly fun, I guess, in a sense. And it's sort of one of those overlooked little mini movement motifs that it's just generally also just fun to collect, to analyze. And
the Fallout games would always have the parodies of 50s infomatics and kind of slideshows. That arose in the 2000s. Man, maybe I should help out with that. Maybe
because it was there's an element of nostalgia too. You can't deny that. There's for sure. It's just a little bit of that. And another one that I've just particularly found sort of fascinating because it is so far from my actual design aesthetic, and also it's very conservative coded, is what we call soft countryana, which is this style that I had no clue. It's so overlooked. It is honestly, technically, probably the most prominent style of the 1980s. I know we think it's Memphis and fun colors and wacky shapes and or really gold glam, glamorous stuff. But no, the 80s was filled with it's basically the country geese thing, pastels, frilly, frumpy bed sheets. And
whenever I think of the country geese aesthetic, I think about the Mad TV sketch where they did the home improvements sketch where they switched it. And anyway, they changed someone's apartment to be covered in geese, and she's just picking them up and freaking out.
This is so interesting.
Yeah. It's a weird,
This feels like if you're watching I've been watching Twin Peaks right now, and it's in the rich conservative person's home. This is how they do it.
That was what it was coded as, at the time.
Where they're very protective of their daughter and that kind of stuff. Yeah, there's chastity to this.
It's so bizarre looking back on it, because there's I'm just so confused. There's all these little girls dressed in prairie dresses and very poofy little shoulders and outfits and sun hats, and it is very Reaganite conservative. Going
it's also
back
hot
to,
off the bicentennial too.
True.
76, and then give it some time to catch that.
I think there's definitely some influence of that in terms of 1976. So happening on that.
So bringing it around to Whimsicraft, when did that first start getting identified?
That one, trying to think back, it was, I think, sometime around 2017 or 2018. Mm-hmm. That was kind of an era of an explosion of aesthetic study for us, when we were kind of migrating a bit away from the Facebook groups and onto Discord. I don't think there even is technically a Facebook group for Whimsicraft,
right.
Doesn't exist. Yeah. But at this point, when we were able to move on to Discord, I basically had I held off creating a ton more Facebook groups just because they were becoming, again, so unmanageable. And I had so much built up research and scans and everything that I had been collecting, that I just went onto the Discord and basically created 50 different channels of all the different things I was just looking into, whether it was totally ready for prime time at that time. And one of them was called, and I have these that's what happens a lot with our aesthetic names, is we have to workshop them a lot, because what I'll come up with initially is this very verbose adjective filled thing,
and they
where
whittle down, and you guys kind of vote in the end.
We do a lot of the time. We do Actually, pretty much all the time. Yeah, we vote. It is sort of, trying to be democratic, and we'll kind of workshop ideas and people present options. So I think Whimsicraft was initially called like DIY, handmade, artsy fartsy, 80s, 90s, or something like that. Like,
I think you got to start from there and then whittle away.
Smush it, make a bunch of, we love portmanteaus, or so we'll have a lot of those. But yeah, that basically I posted that onto the Discord. I'll just kind of dump a ton of examples. I think, I think that they fit. We'll workshop the name. And I believe I coined that. Sometimes we have to go back and see, exactly on, September 17th, 2018 or something, who really proposed it. But yeah, just, whimsical plus crafted. I think another option was whimsifolk, because a lot of this has folk art influence too. But it's also kind of a good one.
I think you made the right choice.
I think it's a really good name. And I think a fun place to maybe start talking about Whimsicraft is by thinking about our teachers or librarians, because I'm a librarian, who embody this style. They can be from our own lives, because like the people who are really into this aesthetic, they typically came out of the art world or they're interested in it to some degree. Do you have an art teacher that stands out in your personal history?
Yeah, I did have like one particularly great art teacher that I had in middle school. There's always like, I did have a couple teachers that, you remember like really fondly, that they just kind of encourage you to just go in whatever direction you wanted, just to have fun with anything that you did, whether it turned out great or not. And so, I don't remember her name. It was ages ago. But unfortunately, like, I had also had a lot of bad teachers, and probably one of my worst was my art teacher in high school.
Yeah. Okay, I'm not alone in that. That's good to know.
She did not want to be there at all. It was. I mean, I kind of feel a little bad for her that she because she just did not seem to be enjoying herself. But yeah, no, I'd go up and ask her a question. She'd be like playing like Minesweeper or something, and she'd be like, "Get away from the desk." I don't want to talk about it. She was just not having it, and she gave me a not so great.
But how did she dress?
She's not a great example. She was kind of so bland. No, I do remember like that art teacher in middle school, like the one I actually remember like pretty well, and like encouraged kind of creativity. She did definitely have that art teacher aesthetic of the kind of like, I think she did like craft patchwork onto her own clothes, and would have like just wacky necklaces all the time. Like the.
Yeah,
I think it was like polymer clay was a big thing in the 90s. So she would have like that, and like, yeah, I mean, she did dress like pretty like exuberantly from what I can vaguely remember. But yeah, I did have some of that.
Yeah, wacky necklaces have been a way to signal your affiliation with the art world for a really long time, and into the present day, you still see art curators and docents rocking their best $100 gift shop jewelry from whatever museum they're working for.
I think the turtleneck comes in handy there too, to protect you from the chunkiness of the necklace. They both work together.
Padding there, yeah.
That's a good observation. But yeah, I had a middle school art teacher who dressed very 70s in this sort of Star Wars way, where she'd always wear a really thick headband, and then she had really thick glasses. But she'd wear vests that were embroidered in a way that like felt really Whimsicraft. Because there was this TikTok that came out maybe a year or two ago, but it was whose art teacher died in Ohio. I'm going to link it in the show notes. And it's a really good example of how you dress in a Whimsicraft style. Because a lot of our images we collected, they're of interiors or of objects that were designed to look like this. All of us can conceptualize in our mind what this aesthetic looks like on clothing, but there aren't many examples out there besides this TikTok video.
Yeah, I mean, I do remember there's kind of an adjacent style that I've been interested in recently that it's like tangential to Whimsicraft, but I do remember that one having like this tie into particularly like elementary school teachers in the 90s, because there's like a TikTok I think about it where they always kind of had those jean dresses with like the little apples and like what we call is like primitive Americana, or like American folk art. That would be kind of the influence on it, but it would have like the little stitching visible, and like that same color palette of like blue denim and like with pockets, and then it'd have the little like patched on apples and little houses and people and things like that.
I literally have a photo of this from this weekend. I was on the ski trip with my mom, and I learned that my mom has all of our family photos on iCloud. They are digital camera photos. At some point, she put them on her Mac back in like 2010, and then they all jumped to iCloud in like 2015 or something. And I have a photo of me with my elementary teacher wearing a jean thing with apples embroidered onto it. So I think we'll add that in the show notes, maybe.
They have that's what it's like. It was that like 90s oh my God, like mom vest,
Yeah.
where it's like with applique, little things like patched onto it, which is kind of a little bit, in the side of Whimsicraft a bit.
Yeah.
To it.
Mm-hmm.
And then have either of you seen Ghost World?
No.
I have seen it a long time ago.
I had to look it up.
Yeah. Well, there's an art teacher in the movie that really embodies this well. Like both in terms of the zaniness, she celebrates the main character making honestly very offensive art piece or saying that she did. But the way that she dresses, it's a good example. There are a few pictures on our Pinterest board, but it's typically really bold, saturated colors. Not as much the patterns, but a little bit of that. And then handmade jewelry. These are all things we'll get to later, but I think she's one of the best depictions of an art teacher in media.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely want to talk about the artsy aunt character. I have some example. Yeah, I have at least one example of it. That's great too.
Yeah. I had a very mean art teacher in high school, but she dressed in this style still, but it just didn't match her personality. She was semi-recently widowed. I remember hearing that about her. And so I think that she just still had the outfit, but on the inside, the whimsy was kind of gone. But then in middle school, I had an English teacher who I think was in her heart an art teacher, but like just forced to be an English teacher. And my reasoning for this comes from the fact that she made us all listen to Natasha Bedingfield's Unwritten, that song, and then write an essay about it in 6th grade.
That's right.
Which is such a power move to just like have your favorite song and have all your children write about it.
I think that teachers should be able to push their personal interests on their students. It's kind of fun,
Yeah, you got to entertain yourself. I think that it keeps the teacher more engaged. It's often important.
Yeah. So now I think we can get into the elements of Whimsicraft. So what are the components of this aesthetic? The first one, which you've already mentioned, is saturated colors. You can see colors on our Pinterest board, like lapis lazuli, fuchsia, lilac, and matte gold. Really any color, if it's saturated enough, can kind of work. But I do think greens are kind of absent, and then grays are kind of absent, but grays can't be saturated. So that's why they're not on the board.
Mm-hmm. The gold really stands out to me. It's like such a yellow. I was thinking like, is that goldenrod? It's not goldenrod. That is goldenrod is much more muted. Like this is a bright yellow.
Yeah. I say it's like matte gold, but it's a bit more yellow than orange than the typical matte gold from the 70s.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's basically, from what I can see, is the objective is to be as loud and bold as possible with the colors and the patterns, and just to like just make it as bright as possible. It's generally, it's a very like loud, playful, expressive aesthetic. Sometimes there can be a side of it that again, more on like the folk arty influence side, or the specifically the Mackenzie Childs. We'll get into it. Yeah, the Mackenzie Childs side of it is obviously a lot more pastel than that. But yeah, generally,
it's interesting. Like whimsy in general is like kind of getting in touch with your childlike side, and I feel like this aesthetic is strangely both childish and old as well, because it's like I'm picturing old art teachers kind of wearing overalls and like baby clothes in a way. It's two different sides of life. It feels very unmiddle-aged in some ways.
It does, yeah. It's like,
or definitely not like 20s, 30s age. You can't picture someone, a young adult, wearing this stuff.
Yeah. It typically doesn't look aged as in weathered, but it looks aged as in rustic. Like someone who didn't go to college made this.
yeah.
The appeal to the folk.
It's a bit, like outsider art or something, or like self-taught. Yeah. Like, rustic, handcrafted, hand-painted, everything. Yeah.
And then one more thing on saturated colors. This is a theory I will never be able to prove, but I think that maybe color photography could have created a feedback loop that encouraged more saturated colors in consumer goods. Because I know this just from my friends who have analog cameras where they have taken color film, that colors look more saturated and things are not as bright as they looked from these colored photographs from the 90s and 80s. Like, I think that could have encouraged people to then seek out brighter colors, after they see celebrities wearing a color that they think is 2 shades brighter than it actually was.
You're chasing the super real, basically.
Yeah. And then the next element we can talk about is celestial symbols. But I don't know if you, because, we've been working on this docket, we've been in communication a bit, but I don't know if you saw that and cringed a bit, because this is actually a bit more whimsigothic.
True. They do have a fair amount of overlap just with like existing at like the same time. They're both like kind of contemporaneous with the late 80s, early 90s. Whimsicraft can use like celestial symbols, but obviously it's generally like a much brighter, lighter sort of aesthetic, and with much more of an emphasis on other more abstract symbols as well, like in conjunction with celestial ones. But yeah, they do show up in both.
I love the symbol of the sun in its splendor, which is the like heraldic name for when you see a sun that has the face on it. Really, it refers more to the squiggly rays. It's sun in its splendor with face is how you would say it in like coat of arms, heraldic stuff. And I think that with the face is a little more whimsicraft. Without the face, I think then you get a little more squarely in the Whimsicraft, because then you'll have a moon with it as well. You'll have the dual kind of symbol.
The jewel one feels really Whimsicraft to me.
Yeah.
Because my mom actually, she had a bathroom in the 90s where she had a lot of those sun motifs, usually half moon, and then all of this like blue glass that I think she was thinking of Venice when she went out and bought it.
I love when Midwestern moms would just go crazy with a bathroom sometimes. I think it's an Onion article, but it's like, wow, this bathroom in Cleveland totally feels like it's in the tropics. Like, because sometimes for a guest bathroom, a mom would do like, oh, let's make this a little beachy. Let's have a little
I don't know what was
sand
going on with the tropical fish bathrooms in the 90s, because I have found so many of those, and they could be very
they were
elaborate.
stronger the more inland you got. Basically, the more we yearn for the sea.
Yeah. And then it's tempting to think that the celestial symbols for both Whimsicraft and Whimsy Gothic started to get into pagan crystal lady territory, but it never got quite that far. They were reserved. They didn't want to start to actually look like witches too much.
No.
True. It is kind of like this, I consider like a 80s, 90s touching your foot into new agey kind of things, which was just like floating around in the ether at the time, was like this general idea of like, I'm spiritual, but I don't know exactly, but we're just going to like kind of pull a little bit from here, a little bit from there. Like, but yeah, never like delving like fully into something.
Nothing that would like endanger the kind of like Abrahamic monotheism kind of thing. Like it's all squarely within the realm.
Nothing that would risk your salvation.
No, exactly.
Yeah. And then the next element is heavy patterns and ornamentation. So we mentioned the Who's Our Teacher Died in Ohio TikTok in the beginning. That's a really good example of some of the patterns that circulated. These include things like zigzags, checkerboard patterns, and spirals.
From what I can tell, like there's an aspect of the patterns I think is influenced just from a revival of both like, I guess primarily British and American folk art. Again, it would be called like primitive American art, where you look back at it and there's a lot of like quilting with like, and the quilts that kind of lend themselves to having like really, really loud patterns, like little color blocking of checkerboards, especially. But then you have this really interesting influence where it takes that folk art movement influence from that much earlier era in like the 1800s, early 1900s, and then combines it with like these newly emerging movements that then bring all these totally different patterns like to the table, where you end up with like what we call it like Pacific punk wave, which is like this graphic design style from that merged kind of on the West Coast in the 70s and like the 80s. Memphis design, especially with its own patterns.
Yeah, that's what I was really interested in, because Memphis is like coming from a kind of like corporate architecture, very like high-minded, established background, as far from folk art as you can get. And its original incarnation is just very sharp. Well, I mean, the shapes can be globular, but they're clearly defined. The human hand is not felt in Memphis stuff at all. And then so I would see some Memphisoid shapes sometimes in Whimsicraft photos, but then it's like covered in a patch or something.
Yeah, they're
like,
irregular.
Oh, there it is. There's the human hand. Now we're back firmly in the land of Whimsicraft.
It's like, it's trying to recreate it on your own with like a paintbrush or something, where you're just kind of, it's just kind of fascinating, because I've noticed that with a lot of these, like, I guess you could consider it, Whimsicraft is kind of like a neo folk art type movement, where it's taking influence from design styles that were, in a sense, like the high art sort of world. Like they would emerge, with Memphis from Italy, or like the Lower East Side art scene, in New York, with some artists, especially like Rodney Greenblatt or Keith Haring, even some of those influences. And, like these sort of larger, part of the art world, part of the design world sort of designers, but then they would filter through various magazines, design magazines. I feel like people, who are like local artisans or something, like, or suburban moms, anybody would just like, they'd start to see this, and that influence would sort of trickle down into like various communities, and that would be kind of floating in the back of their head, and they'd feel sort of inspired to then, well, I'm going to create, based on that, or just, it would subconsciously just sort of get into their designs and mix in.
That's what, I don't know. I was making sure I had a firm understanding of the difference between art and craft ahead of this episode. And one of the things we all kind of intuitively know that like art is high-minded, expressing ideas, addressing like the idea of form and beauty, and craft is more about the art of making it itself, the creative act. And it's also, with a craft, you can find an instruction for a craft in a way that you can't for an art, like whether it's macrame or crocheting or something, like replication is a part of craft in a way that it is not an art.
And that is a huge part, I think, of this aesthetic is the proliferation of like do-it-yourself craft books and art and like, create your own, like decorate your table. I mean, I feel like I found like
how many ways to paint a table.
Yes.
It's funny because nowadays, you see those videos like removing the paint from this beautiful armoire and it's like, oh, we're undoing all the Whimsicraft from the late 80s, 90s.
Yeah, repaint the wall.
I know people where I've had to like mute their content because they just go out and they buy dressers to then paint in their spare time, and it just makes me so angry.
I have seen some very terrible here's my 50s pink bathroom. Like no, like getting rid of every single thing in it, and there's a huge backlash in the comments.
Yeah. So one pattern I want to do a deep dive into is Mackenzie Childs' courtly checks pattern. So Mackenzie Childs, it's a New York State-based ceramics company that started in 1983. It came out with this pattern called courtly checks in 1993. It was originally made to look like the white tiles of this black and white tile pattern were sort of marshmallow-esque. They have these smears that are a bit brown, a bit blue, a bit black. They've toned down that marshmallowness a bit over time, but it's still their most popular pattern. And that one, it has this like organicness that I would never think like a checkerboard tile could be anything but artificial. Like, have you ever seen that image of, I think it's a flounder, but they have camouflaged their body to look like a checkerboard pattern and it can barely do it. Like, like a checkerboard tile pattern is the farthest thing away from nature that you can kind of get.
Yeah, it feels, the grid itself just already feels like a step away from nature. Like, sometimes things will cleave on 90 degrees, with like minerals.
Yeah, and I think even at the time, like probably, when that was being created in the 80s and 90s, checkerboard was very, very heavily associated in like the popular design consciousness with like either like 50s Populux Googie, like a diner or something like that, like very clean, streamlined sort of modern sort of styles. Again, also with neoclassical, but much earlier. But it's still very not natural.
Was it associated with Alice in Wonderland? Like, do you think Mackenzie Childs' brand was trying to look like that?
That's what it comes across to me. Like, it just like it's so linked with it to me.
I tried to look into. And I haven't dived into it like a ton, but what were Mackenzie Childs' actual like original influences? What were the like ideas behind this? And I don't know.
Marshmallows.
It was marshmallow. It is funny how like if you just tweak the perfect checkerboard just the slightest bit, it reads so differently. Because like it's just that the fact that the tiles aren't pitch black either. There's that little like lightning, and these are all handmade pieces, right?
Yeah, and I saw a video of someone doing it, and it looked like it probably is so much fun to make, but they have a square brush, and then they just, by hand, will make the checkerboard. So each piece is unique. I'm really upselling them right now. These pieces are very expensive.
Yeah.
But if you want to go out and buy them, like you can decorate your whole house with Mackenzie Childs goods, and it will cost you an arm and a leg. They're really expensive.
You posted a video about the history of courtly check, and it's a person from the company explaining it. And I noticed they're very on it with the trademark, because they have courtly checks trademarked and they seem pretty protective of it, which doesn't seem very whimsical to me. I would say.
Yeah. Well, the brand actually got sold by the founder in 2001. So Victoria Mackenzie Childs, she sold it. And I want to talk about her a bit because she is so interesting. This is like a rabbit hole that I feel like I can dive into, because she sold the company in 2001. She then went and bought in 2003 the last remaining ferry from Ellis Island and then lived on it for a decade.
She's the final boss of Whimsy. She is.
But there's a video I found where she shows off her kitchen from the ship. I'll link it in the show notes, but she does all this like crazy stuff. Like she has a literal like lever and like weights that she uses to open up a cabinet, and it sounds like stuff is breaking when she does it.
There's a Rube Goldberg contraption to open up. The video opens with her like climbing through a porthole into her, again, houseboat that she lives on, carrying some bouquets of wildflowers. She then takes off her boots, fills those with water, and puts the flowers in those. Like, she can't be stopped. Like, she's amazing.
Yeah.
But like, if you look at her background, like, she's kind of squarely in a traditional art thing, but I feel like she's chasing that outsider art look. Like, she's a like totally within her faculties, just kind of like, you know, zany woman who is like, I think, chasing the insanity that like that outsider arts work with.
No, she's totally a lifestyle brand for wacky grandmas. Like, there's something that's like Grimes-esque about her, where it's like, wow, you're really doing this of your own accord. You really are. And that she does dress kind of Whimsicraft, but her hair, it's like she typically has it in a ton of different pastels, but they look faded in this way that just does not look appropriate.
I think that she's reaching the limits of like hair technology. I think she's trying to go for the saturated Whimsicraft colors, but you just can't do that on human hair. And so it comes out in this kind of like faded, more natural way.
Yeah. Although their brand is typically more pastels, right?
True. Yeah. It definitely does lean much more pastels. Kind of as the opposite of Mary Englebright. Yeah.
And then the next element we can talk about is handmade goods. So this is kind of the whole reason for the aesthetic. Coming into this episode, I thought it was really about the color scheme, because there is this really particular, you know, lapis lazuli, matte gold, fuchsia color scheme that stands out.
If you squint and look at the Pinterest board, like, you could tell it against like any of our other Pinterest boards. Yeah.
Yeah, and has a particular look, but handmade goods are really the reason for this aesthetic. It's all about repurposing found objects or making things that look rustic.
Yeah, it's hard to say if this was like an especially rich period in handicraft, but
I've been trying to figure out like more of the sort of economic context behind what allowed this to sort of proliferate. And I mean, I believe kind of like, again, with what I feel like there was like a reemergence of, or what could be called like this new folk art movement, and this real intense fascination and emphasis on like creating your own furniture, and then like the rise of these like local artisans who would, like, you know, they'd have their own sort of particular style, and then they would kind of become like prominent. What I find very interesting is that there is a series of books that I stumbled on really luckily in just a random used bookstore. It's called The Guild, a source book of American craft artists. And it is absolutely fascinating. It is like each one of them, issued annually, is 300 pages filled with every single possible like design field of artists and artisan and like craftsperson trying to sell their goods. So you have people crafting their own like light fixtures or glass art, quilting, paper wall art, furniture, anything. And they would just be filled to the brim with so many pieces that I like was particularly fascinated with. Okay, so like, I guess I feel like sort of the larger upper middle class boomer economy at the time could like support this, and this is like me just sort of thinking out loud because I don't have like, you know, the hard facts and figures, but it just feels like at that time there was this like appetite for, you know, I'm in the upper middle class. I'd like to support my local artisans, and I'd like to show off, you know, their pieces in my new little McMansion or something like that.
No, I think it was, I don't know. My mom was very into making jewelry in this period, and she's continued making jewelry, and definitely her stuff in this era. The most Whimsicraft it got was when we were living in Arizona, and she was doing like big, chunky turquoise stuff. She kind of stopped doing that. I think after, right around probably the Great Recession, I'd say, the Great Cultural Shift.
Yeah, the Guild source book disappears right after,
right around
almost
then.
Disappears.
Yeah, but I think it was something about we were living in these just like cookie cutter, not McMansions, but just like suburban tract homes. And so I think that the moms living in this environment were like, we have to customize this. We have to somehow, like, I think they just have this built-in creativity that was being kind of shackled by these Sunbelt environs.
Yeah.
I do think it was sort of a reaction against kind of that suburbanization of American design, and then also kind of the homogenization of various design trends that become popular, even kind of like that's omnipresent soft countryana thing, where it kind of maybe felt a little bit like suffocating, where the houses would be like, you know, be colonial or be country, French country or whatever, like, you know, just those overarching styles. People wanted something a little bit more quirky with identity in it, and also something to possibly tie them back to whatever sort of was left of local community and like a suburban environment.
And I think the most accessible handmade goods for crafting were and continue to be jewelry, like what your mom was doing. I mean, you can't even tabulate how many people are out there making jewelry in their spare time for fun. But most of it from this time period would probably fit into the Whimsicraft aesthetic.
I think so. I did exclude them. I don't even know. I mean, I excluded them from the board, but that magazine that I found, that I had posted some examples of like the clothing from that one. There was stuff that I would consider Whimsicraft, and it's really fun, little, again, like swirlies and like just various polymer clay oddities that would be in there. But additionally, it's a bit of a tangent, but the fact is that there's so much of this like primitive indigenous art appropriation going on in the late 80s and early 90s that again is what we would more kind of associate with like the Global Village coffee house sort of style. But I do find it fascinating that it's very, very prominent in that era, kind of adjacent to Whimsicraft that people were creating. But yeah, it's in the clothing. There's so much jewelry with like petroglyphs on it and like sort of indigenous imagery. It gets,
I will say, I'm not to put my mom on blast, but she was definitely dipping her toe, I think, lightly into that, maybe a little bit. But when I was at O'Hare Airport, there is this, it was closed because I was there late at night, but there's this like Southwestern style jewelry place that's frozen in time. Like it's called like Running Coyote or Fox or something. And I'm pretty sure it's in papyrus font, like the title for it. But it is like, that. And that is...
Cocopelli earrings or something.
No, again, living as a kid in Arizona, I have a photo of me like in a Cocopelli shirt. Like that was the biggest thing. Like there was I don't know, in that kind of Sun Belt suburbanism of this time, I think there was looking for any kind of authenticity, and the Cocopelli was all that people could find. The people who don't know, like Cocopelli is this like Native American, I think Hopi or Navajo, or maybe, I don't know. But it's this character from mythology who's playing a pipe. And it just went crazy in the 90s. People love it.
I do have one suggestion for why maybe that imagery became more popular. Maybe National Geographic, people were subscribing to it more again. Because anthropology has been trendy at different times. Like in the 60s, 50s, when National Geographic took off, they popularized popular interest in anthropology.
Interesting.
But the next element we can talk about is broken tile mosaics. So these are the type of mosaics where you make them by taking a square tile, smashing it, and then rearranging it until it starts to resemble a form that you are picturing in your mind.
Yeah, that one, it does. I've been trying to look into, when I was, finding how prominent it was in Whimsicraft, I was trying to find the history of broken tile mosaics and where they had emerged from and kind of when they had popped up in history prior to sort of the Whimsicraft era. And the earliest I was able to find is that, and I really just found out this recently, but in England in the, I believe, 1870s or 1880s, it was called booty wear. Boody.
I don't know why I've heard of that.
Wear. And I'd never heard of this term before, but they noted that it was initially just kind of, they call it a children's play toy, which is broken, I guess broken kids, and they had nothing else. You play with broken glass. But, and then kind of eventually it started to be incorporated into like handcrafted pottery, and that became known as booty ware. And then that kind of, they would take like broken china plates or something like that and piece it back together. And, it does show up also a lot in, a Gaudi sort of style, the Catalan modern, I believe it's called Catalan modernisme, which is like Gaudi style, where of course it's these sort of biomorphic, organic sort of forms coated with mosaic tile.
That's where it really kind of clicked for me, because I realized that's how you can create these like rounded shapes. It's hard with a square tile. Like if you actually break it down, you're able to like use the grout and actually kind of create these sinewy forms that people want in Whimsicraft.
Yeah. And good news. So probably a lot of the mosaics that were created during this time period are going to survive a long time just by the nature of mosaics surviving a long time. Like so many ancient Roman ones surviving in the present day just because it's such a sturdy medium.
Yeah. All the macrame from this period will not last, but the mosaic shall.
Yeah. And on, commenting about, Victorian children making broken tile mosaics. I made a broken tile mosaic with my sister when I was a kid. So it's not like a good activity for the kid to break up the tile. Like, yes, they can hurt themselves,
dangerous.
but giving them to kids to arrange, like, that's fine.
Yeah,
That's good.
Yeah. There is. Yeah, the next thing we're going to talk about is the outsider art aspect of it. But I think it's also what I said earlier, that getting in touch with your inner child kind of thing. Like a lot of these crafts are something that, like, yes, an adult could do well, but a child could do like 50% as well. I would say.
Yeah, outsider art is something that one of our listeners recommended we do an episode on in the future. I think it's a good idea, so we'll save some of our thoughts on it. But I think one particular branch of outsider art, it really reads as Whimsicraft, and that's what I call junk art. So this is when you, usually on your property, you start amassing tons and tons and piles of rusty consumer goods, and then you start welding them together into recognizable forms like flowers or animals.
I think this is the most like modern American form of folk art because all the components that you need are just so unique to the American experience. Having enough land to store junk on it, that's pretty American. Having lots of industrial detritus, that's American as well too. And having welding ability. I think this is all downstream from car culture. Like I'm sure you can find junk art from before World War II, but like it must have really exploded after. And when I think of like this welded art, I'm picturing like Route 66 roadside Americana.
Yeah.
You know,
you're not picturing Peggy Hill welding.
I am picturing Peggy Hill. I feel like I've done this on multiple episodes where like something will happen. I'm like, yes, that was an episode of King of the Hill. That was season 4, episode 3. But yeah, Peggy starts making these propane can characters. And what she makes is like an Abraham Lincoln, a Statue of Liberty. Like there's something like, what is the medium is the message is the McLuhan quote. McLuhan, like if your medium is like propane tanks and car parts, you're going to make American things. Like it's all part of that. I'm going insane, I think.
Yeah. And then one element that might be included in Whimsicraft pieces is forks. I don't know what it is.
I think you're trailblazing with this, but you're right.
Yeah. No, it's like I would look at an image and I would really question, is this Whimsicraft? And then if I notice a fork, I would be sold. I'd be like, yes, it is.
Yeah. They pretty much put forks and spoons on anything. I think there's a chair. I think I've seen it on chairs, hanging light fixtures, anything. Yeah. Basically, it's whatever you have around
It's funny.
your house.
It kind of reminds me, we did an episode on like 2000s humor, and just I remember like spoon, like that being just a funny thing in the 2000s. And there is something just, I think, inherently inappropriate about spoons and forks. Not inappropriate in like a rude way, but just like, oh, that goes in your mouth. Why would it be on a chair? Like I think that's just, it's elementally confusing.
Yeah. And then the next section, we can get into media that exemplifies Whimsicraft. So we can start with the Magic School Bus. So from your expert opinion, do you think it really counts?
From that show, I really don't actually remember a lot like of an emphasis on craft or even really like thinking back to like Miss Frizzle's outfits.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
From what I remember, like she had like a theme that was appropriate for the episode or something for each one that would go like, put planets on it or like some like fish hat or something. I don't know what she'd have, but I don't know if that, she's certainly very whimsical, but I don't know about the crafts part. Although she was probably crafting each one of those outfits.
I think that when things get too much into the STEM and science side of it, then we get into the kind of scholastic utopia. Right, utopian scholastic aesthetic, and I think that when things stay a little bit more on the art teacher's side of the hallway, then we're in.
It's got to be like a bit messy, although they get messy.
Yeah,
yeah.
But Whimsicraft is generally a bit messier.
But I think that it is kind of a united thing in people's head, where they're like, "Oh, crazy dressed art teacher's Miss Frizzle." Like that is just like a congealed concept.
Yeah, I think it's partly the red hair. Like that's part of why the teacher from Ghost World has like dyed orange hair. It reads as being really on brand for eccentric women of the 90s.
Yeah. It's an eccentric thing. It's like acceptable eccentricity. It's not like having I was going to say like having a shaved head, but I remember an art teacher in my school with a shaved bald head. Actually, I feel like that's the next level. Like after you dye your hair red, it's like, no, this isn't artsy enough. I need to be bald.
And then the next piece of media we can talk about is Harriet the Spy. So have either of you ever seen it?
No. I did. Yeah. A couple years ago. Yeah. Oh, wow. I really loved that movie actually. Yeah. I was like so surprised at how much, because I remember it existing like in the back of my head, like in the 90s, like actually when I was like 6 when it came out. But yeah, I didn't ever get to see it. But because I didn't know much about the story, but it was like a lot darker and sadder than I had come into it with. Like I had no idea it was like that, but I think I enjoyed it. Yeah.
I hadn't read the book or seen the movie. I didn't realize the movie had Michelle Trachtenberg as the main character, and she just passed away recently. But I don't know. It's so interesting. This book is from the 50s, but it's like reinvented in this very, very 90s like kind of style. Like they don't try and place it in that period. They do try and fully update it.
Yeah, there's no way I know we're about to talk about it, but the main Whimsicraft element of it is the wind chime garden, which is one of my favorite scenes of absolutely of that movie, and just most anything from the 90s. But there's no way that was in the 50s book. Probably not. But the found object art park. Motif.
Yeah, so in that scene, Harriet and her friends, they're tasked with basically turning a giant tree into a craft. They start to rope together all these ties and then they throw them over the tree. And in between, they're doing all these things like blowing bubbles and drinking soda. But it made me realize something about junk art too. Like they blow bubbles with what looks like a potato masher. And I was like, oh, that's so creative. How did they think of that? But it made me realize that junk art is so generative because when you see just all this stuff jumbled together and it's all at random, you can just like piece things together and you're like, oh yeah, there's synergy. What if I just combine them?
Yeah, and then even the title of the movie, like Harriet the Spy, this is something we talked about. We had an espionage episode, but a child's idea of spy is so different and detached from the adult concept of espionage. Like I think children have this real fascination with secrets. Like there was back in around kind of this time in the 80s, there was a Marvel arc called Secret Wars, and it was named that just because the word secret and wars pulled very well with kids in terms of recognition. Like I think kids really do just want to have like a secret world or a secret life or discover something outside of what adults know about, because then they can actually like own and possess something that can't be taken away by adults. I don't know. That's my little harebrained theory.
Yeah. I think children's content about spies, it's closer to mysteries, which Spy-Fi, it comes out of mysteries. And I think it's closer to that. It has other things, like usually involves family members, but typically it's just a mystery with more gadgets. It's not like involving international agencies beyond the idea of an agency.
Yeah, and then a light example of this is the first Spy Kids movie in Floop's Castle. That's pretty whimsy-crafty, but it's maybe a little too detached from reality in any way. Like it doesn't feel like it's handcrafted. It feels like it's grown organically from something.
Is that I was trying to look into that one. It was the hand sculpture.
Oh, the hand chair as well.
Because that one I was interested. Because that one I think I know that's like from the 60s. Like pop art. There's one we have a little category on CARI called radical surrealism, which is a bit of a tangent, but it's like that pop arty. There's a movement like Italian radicals that were like create an oversized pop object of everything. Like there'd be like oversized like a falling over column, make it a chair or something like that, or like it's basically became like in the 80s. There was a store called Think Big, which is just so much fun. I think they use it in there's some movie that uses it, but they had a chain of stores all across the country and probably internationally that just sold oversized versions of
like
everyday objects, paper clips, pencils, like anything you could imagine. I can't believe.
Was it in the movie Big with Tom Hanks? Maybe
I think it was.
That would line up.
I'm trying to remember what other movie. They appear everywhere. Like you'll find like in just like random movies from the 80s and 90s. Like that's from that store or something. But yeah, no, that the Floop's Castle thing was interesting because we have that sort of under an example of a revival of another style, which was we call it either Nouveau Organic or I call it Org Nouveau because it's like a mixture of Art Nouveau and organic sort of styles from like Gaudi basically that. There was a huge amount of that in the 90s, a real emphasis, and it is somewhat kind of a little bit tangential to Whimsicraft just because it has this emphasis on it's still like handcrafted. None of it's like machine made or anything like that, but it just kind of ties into the fact that throughout the 90s, there was this huge swing away from what people felt like the 80s was. I have so many magazine articles where they're like, it's 1990. It's going to be a brighter, like a lighter, like more friendly decade or something like that.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
I'm picturing like stern-faced men in Armani suits and like
the yuppie sort of clean, sleek laser grid and, Memphis, which was still very clean, like that sort of style. And then transitioning to the 90s. And everything was sleek.
A lot of it wanted the human touch again. Yeah.
And Whimsicraft definitely does have this lightness, this brightness, this utopianism and optimism. But now we can introduce the next piece of media, which goes into the sort of dark side of the Whimsicraft aesthetic, because we're going to break down 3 substyles in a little bit. But Crashbox, which premiered in 1999, it has this found object look that feels a bit like post-apocalyptic, because the show, it starts out with this intro where there's a brain that gets crushed by a computer. The computer, it opens up, and it's the scene of all of these little robots working in what looks like a factory. And they're all made out of vaguely trashed objects. And it's a much different aesthetic than all of the other things we've talked about so far.
Yeah, I would definitely consider that's a great example of, you know, how kind of Whimsicraft can be like, it's considered kind of like an umbrella term, but you know, there is such a variety underneath it. You could probably keep going further and further and name these like some styles, which at CARI we have to be careful with. Sometimes we'll end up with like 200 of them, but yeah, no, it's, you know, it's obviously very different from Mackenzie Childs or something like that. And I do notice a lot of that, like that Crashbox look pops up in all sorts of like, you know, it is like a sort of alternative youth sort of style of the 90s. Like it was definitely like marketed more towards like teenagers and like 20 somethings or something, looking for something like sort of edgy looking. There's a style that kind of, when you were mentioning that Crashbox factory look, that was very popular kind of also at the time. We term it like industrial gothic, which is like this like very, you know, dark factory, lots of tubes and metal
Victorian
and
gears, but not steampunk, not the shiny, brassy steampunk.
Yeah, it has like no
rusted
Victorian influence. Yeah, none of like the Victorian stuff. But like a great example is Janet Jackson's like Rhythm Nation music videos. There's one particular that has this like, it's like, you know, steam everywhere. It's you know, it's very, very dark and like very edgy looking. But then there's kind of like Whimsicraft of this side of it, like takes it, and then it's more like handcrafted, obviously. Like they'll, or it'd be like not full scale, like a diorama or something like that, and like stop motion or something.
Yeah. It's, you said stop motion. This made me kind of think, even though it's much later, but the movie Robots from 2005, and I think that, I don't know, in any kind of like rapidly changing aesthetic, the last things to be made, the things that take the longest time, are usually buildings. But I think it's also animated movies, because they take forever to make themselves. And there's also just the movie production period of getting the script together and all that. So I think that the ideas for robots and these like, because in that movie, like the virtuous good robots are like rusty and beaten down a bit. And then this is against the evil sleek robots. And so I'm sure that stuff was being workshopped at least in like 1999 or something within the realm of this.
And I know that for the inspiration for the film, they actually collected junk to then use as inspiration for arms and legs of the robots and things like that.
That's so good.
Which is pretty cool. Yeah. But a movie I do think is pretty close to the Crashbox aesthetic is The City of Lost Children, which also starts to get closer to the steampunk aesthetic. But steampunk, again, it has like more gears, more rivets. They usually look less rusty, and they're more like tastefully placed. With the Whimsicraft trash look, it's a lot more random. Like the image we're going to use for the episode artwork, it has all of these like shopping carts that have just been slammed together. They're going to be at the edge of the image, but like that's just like, yeah, that's not steampunk.
No. It's much more messy. It's not going for like steampunk, where steampunk is going for like kind of evocative of a specific sort of time period. Even though it's an imagined like retro futuristic version of it, it is sort of more cohesive in that way. Whereas like, the sort of industrial messy side of Whimsicraft is just pulling from what's available. I mean, it's exactly, it's found object. Yeah. So it's just going to be a random mishmash of anything.
I'm just thinking of this right now, but I feel like in the industrial Gothic style, there will be gears, but they're never turning anything. They're just stuck on something. Like they're just detritus in that way. But in steampunk, it'd actually be a part of a system, and it's all clicking and whirring.
Yeah. And then another movie I think kind of fits into that dark aesthetic too is The Borrowers. So this came out in 1997. I was really trying to rack my brain to think of more examples of Whimsicraft clothing. You found some right before we started recording, and out of them board, they're really great. But I was thinking about found object look, and I started to think about The Borrowers, because in that movie, there are all these little people that live inside of people's homes, and they're a few inches tall, so then they start to appropriate things like thimbles and paper clips and bottle caps. But yeah, did you look at those images? Do you feel like they fit?
I didn't really look at those too much. because I hated that movie.
Oh, you hated it?
Did it
Okay.
scare you
I have a
as a
weird
child?
irrational fear of like small people.
That's well within your rights.
Like I don't like I don't know whether I mean because I saw it when I was a kid. I remember like when it came out, and oh my god,
I got you. We've all got our little.
I know we got some
our
weird.
quirks. When I was a child, I walked out of the movie Elf. I couldn't watch it.
Really? Okay.
It made me cringe so deeply. It's just he was like flouting all the rules of society and conventions, and no one knew.
I just don't like any movie where it's like little people living like tiny humans living in the walls like freaks. Like even if it's mice, like I didn't like Mouse Hunt, even though I think it's like supposed to be a good movie. But I saw that one, I like hated it.
Yeah.
I just don't like any of these things that involve like. Well, also because I think my family like let me watch like basically anything, which was when I was a kid, which is kind of a mistake. But
I think that's your villain origin story as someone who sorts aesthetics.
Yeah, so I think I saw like
everything.
way too many like puppet master movies.
Well, I have
I
some tips for you. Pour salt by your windowsill and then put iron scissors underneath your pillow.
That's what keeps away borrowers?
That's what keeps away fairies.
Fairies.
It's good to know for that.
But yeah, I won't make you think about the borrowers much more. But now we can talk about the three substyles of Whimsicraft. Do you want to introduce the three?
Yeah. So I think, again, this is still like a work in progress for sure. But the three sort of substyles that I believe, kind of workshopping them, there's, of course, like on one extreme, there's this, British American folk arty sort of style, generally more pastel, heavily checkerboards, Mary Englebright, Mackenzie Childs, hand painted, repainted furniture, influence of definitely obviously like on the influence of like older design movements side and kind of country-ish.
A little bit of Art Nouveau, maybe.
I think a little bit of Art Nouveau could be considered in there, especially when it kind of pulls from those eras, like 1890s, stuff like that. And then like it kind of moves on a spectrum, and then it moves more into this like loud colors, loud patterns that are inspired by more contemporaneous design movements, where it's not like so like focused on reviving something from focusing on like 100 years ago and stuff like that. It's more like Memphis influence, or zigzags, and what Memphis patterns is like Bacterio is a famous pattern that they did, and you could even sometimes it'll show up in Whimsicraft, and that's like clearly a more recent influence, and you get into more of found object elements, less of like the messy industrial like shopping carts kind of one, but more of like forks and spoons and baubles and things hanging down, like so whimsical and playful, would fit in, like that kind of like art teacher, artsy aunt realm of a house, repurposed glass bottles as like a wall divider. So, they can kind of imagine like where that could, and then you kind of take away, you're getting further and further away from like the specific, like the folk art, earlier Americana type stuff. You move more into that crash box, darker MTV, stop motion, especially, I don't know if you mentioned it, but like music videos in the 80s got really heavily into it. You'd see like Peter Gabriel, like Sledgehammer.
I watched the Sledgehammer music video. That's a great example of that. Yeah.
And like Talking Heads. And I actually would consider even Pee Wee Herman. Pee Wee Herman's like set gets into this interesting, it's tough because there's like 400 different things going on that set. And I have to dissect every single one of them. But I believe there is kind of an influence of that, of Whimsicraft there. And that's so much further on the side. So you can see like it has a very wide sort of spectrum to it. But those are what I would consider those sort of three
three strains styles underneath the Whimsicraft umbrella.
And for me, the way I conceptualize them is by color scheme. So one is the fuchsia, lapis, lilac, and matte gold one. The darker one that's browns, rusty metal, aged wood. And then the third one, the playful folk country one, it's a lot of black and white, and then bright colors that are interrupted by patterns, whether they be gingham or florals or that kind of thing.
I think that, definitely sums up that. Yeah.
So thinking about these three styles, I want to pose a question for you. So something on Silent Generation that we've gone back to several times is an idea that came out of C-Punk with Zambel, who coined slime punk as an alternative aesthetic to C-Punk. And she said that utopia needs dystopia. And so basically, it's caused us to continuously go back to the idea that within an aesthetic or a subculture or a genre, there is going to be also a opposite expression of it to some degree. And so I wanted to ask you, is Whimsigothic the opposite of Whimsicraft, or are within the different substyles, is there a yin and a yang, a utopian and a dystopian vision?
I don't know if I would consider Whimsicgothic and Whimsicraft feel like different strains of the same sort of movement that was going on at the time, where because they do share so many similarities, where they have such an emphasis on craft and not so much obviously found objects in Whimsicgothic, but this idea of creating your own style and having this irregularity and hand rusticness to it, or like rough grit to it, or something like that. It has texture. It definitely texture is important in both of these, and there's a lot of irregularity. It's not so like sleek and clean. So it's hard to. I would say that from kind of what I've investigated about the origins of maybe why Whimsicgothic became prominent at the time was, and this is again just sort of thinking out loud based on kind of what I've looked into from the era, it seems like a reaction against kind of like a lot of the trauma of the 1980s, especially like as the 80s wore on and people were like, okay, Reagan's just going to be here like forever. And it's like, where they felt, you could tell like from like, I guess it's anecdotal, but like from what I've looked at media of the time, there's this like feeling that things were going in the wrong direction, especially since so many of these, both Whimsicraft and Whimsicgothic, are so heavily centered on the design community. And the design community at the time was horribly impacted by AIDS at the time. I find it in nearly every design magazine I look at from that era is, just an ongoing, list of, who passed and these like fundraisers and, desperately trying to find some sort of solution to it. And by the late 1980s, you have just, I believe it, especially in the expression of Whimsicgothic, just like a sort of a trauma response of going darker, just expressing this sort of moodiness, and trying to find some sort of catharsis and I don't know, and creation.
It is broad, like both sides of it, the kind of more optimistic fairy Whimsicraft versus the darker one. They're both united in their kind of rebellion against the imposing of like 80s Reaganite order and sleekness on everything. They're just kind of two sides of it, I think.
Yeah. That's what it seems. It sort of feels like that. And, another mission of CARI would be to try a lot harder to talk to designers of the era.
Oh yeah, wow.
Because we do have, we have kind of our sources, the printed media sources, which have been very helpful. But I found it particularly helpful. We haven't done it as much, obviously, focusing on Whimsicraft and Whimsicgothic, but actually, interviewing designers from the time period. And I did this a little bit recently with a designer that he worked primarily in like Global Village coffee house style stuff, and getting to hear his firsthand perspective of what he dealt with at the time period and what his actual influences were, and learning so much more in-depth information about what the design industry was like at that time was like really elucidating for this. But that's kind of something that we're trying to look more into. It's been tough because a lot of the time I contact these designers and they are
retired,
or they're like bizarrely not interested in talking. Like they're confused that we're interested.
Yeah.
They're
I could see that.
They're like, what do you find value in that? Like I did that 40 years ago. Who cares? And I'm like, we love, like people they're surprised that there's such a resurgence of interest amongst like the younger generation in their work and the sort of, retroactively named styles.
It would make for a great podcast if you were able to get more of them to talk and then record them and publicly release them.
Yeah, that's definitely
an idea.
Whatever.
So you just suggested that Whimsicraft, Whimsicgothic partly came out of a response to the conservatism of the Reagan era, right? So let's talk about some of the other reasons why this might have happened. One thing is probably reinterest in arts and crafts, but I think it's kind of hard to say that art fairs were more popular in the mid-80s, mid-90s than they were before. Like, how would you even track
quantify
that?
The number and a size and attendance of local art fairs? Like, it's,
That is tough. I mean, it is, I don't think it was that, I think it was more accessible, or I think there was, I believe there was more of an interest in it because I think more people were finding out that it was like possible to maybe make a career out of it or something like that. Because people have always been, although no, actually, there is an element that, after World War II and you have this huge proliferation of like suburban housing, homogenized sort of design movements, I think, I mean, for a time, there was actually a lot of enthusiasm around that. Like, internationalism, the international modernism styles, like, let's make everything clean and like,
We're solving the problem of living.
Yeah. Like people, before had been living in, to some extent, like, tenements and dirty conditions and like, and everything was like irregular and old. And, you get to move into this like new, fresh suburban home and everything is like clean and standardized and modernized and everything. I think for a time that did sort of impact people's sort of appetite for things that look like Whimsicraft. I mean, I don't think that
people would look at an overly clean and sanitized world and wanted something a little dirty and used. Yeah.
Like there's, specifically either called like Googie or Populux, that sort of style where it's like super clean, super sleek. This
new modern materials, vinyl that won't rust and all that. Yeah.
Linoleum, everything. Vinyl and linoleum. New, better living through chemistry or whatever it's called.
Like clothes bragging that they were polyester, that they contain no natural things. Yeah. And those always come in like waves where that eventually breaks and people are like, no, I want the natural. I want the wrong.
Yeah. But I definitely think it comes with waves that's definitely like a great point because there is sort of a precursor to this a little bit in the sense that the 70s have their own real fascination with like going back to the earth, like the environmental movement, like EPA and Earth Day and, macrame. So I find a lot of that, like, creating your own little macrame baskets to hang your plants. And we have a style called Eco Shed, which is like, it's derived from the name from the shed style, which is like a sort of famous architecture sort of, it's from a sea ranch, which popularized the look of like, when you think of it, it's basically wood paneled everything.
Oh, okay. I can
but especially like angled wood paneling, redwood, lots of cedar and everything. But that was like this back to the earth.
I've heard that shingle modernism. I've heard that called that sometimes.
Yeah. It's definitely shingles too, for sure. And like lots of angled crazy roofs and stuff like that. But
I think the 70s was very schizophrenic in that because it would be like flower patterns, natural stuff printed on, again, 100% polyester. Like it was trying to have both. It was trying to return to nature, but using all these new technologies we had found.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of hard to say, whether or not arts fairs and arts and crafts became more popular. But something I think is probably likely is that outsider art aesthetics became more popular with people who had an interest in the arts. It's just that look, people were gravitating towards it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there was a ton of interest in the late 80s. I mean, you have like about like naive art and stuff like that, and reviving those sort of certain artists from that movement. Again, this sort of sometimes questionable, but the interest in even like Paleolithic, like figures, petroglyphs, things like that, like reviving art that doesn't seem as polished or, it's not, the very clean pop art, like Liechtenstein look or something like that. And that was this general movement towards wanting some sense of like authenticity and return to like handcrafted and
we want unschooled. I think it was, I think that
machine
maybe
made or something. Yeah.
Yeah, and that post-Reagan thing, it's like even the art industrial complex was under suspicion, I think, for people in the 90s of just that like all institutions were suspicious, even like museums and stuff. Like we need to find people untouched from this. And that is often the naive art and the outsider artist.
Yeah. And then another thing I think might have influenced Whimsicraft, although this is a bit more for Whimsigothic, was just the entrance of New Age spirituality into everyday life. We did an episode on new religious movements, and we did a lot of research for that. But an idea I came across was that basically, although new religious movements haven't become the dominant faith in any country, this like sort of vague spirituality has in a way become the dominant faith, where all of these ideas have entered mainstream discourse. So, you could suddenly cover your house in objects and imagery that were reminiscent of the afterlife and witches and celestial bodies, and people wouldn't then eye you with suspicion.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely find just the influence that like non-standard sort of religion, like, like books on Wicca or paganism or just the general, like probably interest in like astrology. And then a lot, especially in the 90s, a fascination with like being Zen. Yeah. We have a style called Zen X, which is like totally all the Zen Buddhism, Japanese influence on interior design and stuff like that. That was very prominent.
Middle-aged men growing ponytails. I'm picturing a lot of this in the 90s. Yeah.
Yeah. Business executives with the little Zen sand garden.
I owned one of those for some reason as a child. I had a miniature Zen garden. But it's with the kind of not a great awakening, but the increasing spiritual side of people post 60s and 70s after the kind of revolution. I think that, yeah, a lot of it trickled down and was made more accessible to people. You could live a suburban life, still go to church, but then have little fun, like spiritual symbols. It could be like parsed by people.
So for the next section, we can talk about Whimsicraft in the built environment. I think this is going to be a good section for both of you as people who work in the design and construction fields. Mm-hmm. Did you want to start out with that art fair in Atlanta?
Yeah, so I know a little bit about this. It's called Bizarre Bizzoso from 1993. There isn't a ton of information on it that I found. There's a couple, articles from the era that is basically one of the, large art fairs that would have a collection of vendors under it, and just to, promote art in the city of Atlanta. I kind of chose it because it just seems to be a particularly great example of kind of almost all of the sort of styles melding together. Those sub-styles that we mentioned of Whimsicraft at the same time appear to be kind of happening all at once. Yeah. It, like a little bit of the checkerboards, like vibrant colors and crazy patterns, and again, like the shopping carts, as you mentioned, and like found object art, all kind of put into this attempt to be cohesive sort of, art sort of style.
So the artwork for this episode, it's like the entrance to the fair, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And it has the word art. It has the word fun. Very important.
It's very whimsical. It's fun. It's some forced fun. I don't know.
It seems like, maybe we can try and narrow down like what is the clearest example of this. But the fact that it is an art fair is so really on the nose.
And I think another example of why I chose one in this particular. I don't know like the backers of it or like how, like corporate it possibly was, but it was actually designed. It's by Lorink Design, which is a very prominent like exhibit design firm. They did they design exhibits for like conferences and convention halls and things like that for various big companies.
I've seen that world a little bit, like, I don't know, in like years ago job searches. And I'm like, this feels parallel to the whole construction world. Like they just build these temporary things that still require a lot of like design and love, but are so fleeting. Do it.
If anybody ever wants to check, there's so many like really fun exhibit design books from this era. Like there's ones that they have like the PS2, the PlayStation. They're wild. Yeah.
You should plug your Patreon.
Oh yeah. It's the Patreon is still under the Y2K Aesthetic Institute, which it was our proto CARI thing that just specifically focused on Y2K futurism or Y2K aesthetic. But my Patreon is Patreon at Y2K aesthetic. There might be a link, probably.
Yeah, because your Patreon, it has scans, high quality scans from like hundreds of books, and you can access many of the things we've been talking about today.
Yeah. I've basically been keeping up because I've been scanning books since 2014, and I have about 700 on there so far. Books, magazines, like some rare, design magazines that have been kind of difficult to find, difficult to source, but I've tried to keep that updated on a monthly basis, and has a huge variety, kind of spanning all the design fields that CARI covers.
And back to Bizarre Bizzoso. So, the entrance, it has the words art and fun next to each other. That word typically does not like to be thought of as whimsical. The people who are in it are very serious. The word artsy gets included in descriptions of Whimsicraft pretty often. In art school, if you use the word artsy, the professor would have had a moment and needed to correct you because you just didn't say that word there.
Yeah. No, it's so... it's so interesting how accessible this side seems because of its level of whimsy. It does feel there. I think here there is just a tremendous amount of up and down movement from the high art to the low art here. This kind of feedback loop of designs coming from the actual design establishment and then filtering through what I'm going to call the suburban mom art world, a parallel art world, and then the times they touch, which is through I think art fairs like this, which would probably have a mix of established artists and locals.
Yeah. No, this side of the art world is probably filled with people like Victoria Mackenzie Childs.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it does sort of. I mean, I don't know if they were exhibiting at that particular Bizarre Bizzoso fair, but we do, again, kind of going back to those guild books, they have so much of this style that I think it's somewhat related to Whimsicraft, but it's we call it contempo eclectic, which is basically, I think it's kind of like Memphis filtered through suburban moms. It's literally, but it's this side that is more. My house is a museum for contemporary art type of this sort of mentality that existed, and it is.
I've always saw the style as middle-aged Jewish suburban home. I'm Jewish, I can say this. But that's like always a style I've seen of just like a very semi-sterile house, but then with very fun modern art on the wall.
That's exactly, oh my God. Okay, you love the books that I've got on that. And actually, what I found is particularly fascinating, it was very huge in the Midwest. Chicago, Michigan. Yeah. There are so many examples of this, like, mainly it's like the house is like all white. It's like what would be called a contemporary house in like the 80s or 90s. Lots of weird shaped windows is mainly what is going on. Lots of vaulted ceilings.
Tombstone windows and stuff.
Yeah. And like, and they'd have one of like the door would be like this crazy stained glass art and like a really like wild what would be called like Memphis or Kandinsky looking inspired pattern, like stuff flying all over the place. But it had a similar mentality of like this stuff was a lot cleaner. This contempo eclectic style, it was not like really like the whole house wouldn't be like painted weird textures and things like that. It was like exhibiting a specific object. But I think fascinatingly, like it also had this element of I'm supporting my local artists, and I'm going to get a piece of crazy sort of like lucite furniture with like all like weird colors or like.
Or when I travel, I get something every time I travel, and I bring that home and I work it into the continuing work of art that is my own home.
Yeah. And it's this idea of definitely, I feel like it was filtering down like major art movements, or major designers would be designing sort of their own like. Obviously it was like Memphis or what even they kind of termed it in the 80s Euro style, which was this overarching term for like basically what it looks like is Patrick Bateman's apartment in American
the Americana Gardens.
It's like super sterile, like super clean, very like sharp and everything. But there's an interesting like cycle or I don't know what you would call it, but like this movement from like what people would see in magazines and like the high art world. And I believe like people in these like suburban locales will be looking through those and being like, well, where can I get something that like, maybe expresses that, but not for like $80,000, and then they'd have, kind of supporting their local, artisan community or somewhat local, but yeah.
Oh, you know what I just remembered? That's a really funny example of outsider art. So I worked for the MCA for a bit, which is a museum of contemporary art in Chicago. But one time I was working there and someone comes up to me holding a piece of art. And I'm like, what is that? And at the time we had our biggest show ever. There were over maybe 300, 400, 500 pieces in this exhibit. It was the largest they'd ever done. So I didn't recognize this piece, but there were more pieces in this museum than ever. I was like, is this one of the pieces? And you just picked it up. But he's like, oh, I just found this. And I was like, what's happening? But apparently there was someone who would go into the museum, try to sell people these like little sculptures that were made out of trash.
But he wouldn't admit that they were his? He was like, oh, I just found this outside.
No, it was someone else who was coming up to me like, hey, what is this? Like, I just found it on the floor. And I was like, where did you... Anyway, but that's an example of outsider art. Like that's the sort of thing they get into. So as opposed to going to an art fair, you can also just, buy it off of someone at the MCA.
That's true. That sounds like a Nathan Fielder bit or something, to go into an art museum and be like, you like this? And then like open your coat and you're like selling like art in the museum. That's similar to it. Yeah. A really great example you added in here, Evan, is Lumpy Gravy, which was a short-lived, about 2 years, restaurant in LA.
Yeah, that one, the story behind that, I am, not super sure of. It seems like it was maybe a friend. So the designer is Gabor Chupo.
Who knows? Hungarian.
Of the very famous Klasky Chupo design animation firm, who did is very famous for the 90s and basically
did Rugrats.
Rugrats, Wild Thornberries. They're very distinct art styles. So
if
you
it
definitely
looks a little bit gross in the 90s. That's how I describe it.
It can be definitely off-putting. But like. So he collaborated, I think, with a friend of his. I feel like this was like so much more common at the time, just to be like, yeah, sure, let's open a restaurant with my random like crazy robot sculptures and stuff like that. So it was an art plus bistro in Santa Monica, and it's just absolutely filled to the brim with like. I mean, you get like whimsical flying insects made of, trash or metal, and robots with blinking lights, and just again like textured walls with like interest. Like I think there's like a clock made of wheels or something, like gears and wheels. Again, kind of going back to that sort of industrial thing.
I love the robot that's in the restaurant. It has this like face that's made out of copper and is covered in Christmas lights. But it has like such a good look, and I wish I could eat there.
Yeah.
You had to catch it for the 2 years. I can't, some of these, I'm just always shocked at like just how short-lived a lot of this stuff is.
Yeah.
It does not last.
No, it's hard. It's like we wish we could have some kind of all the aesthetics we talk about, like you hope they can be committed to architecture because they'll actually stay. Kind of like the mosaic thing, you know, like then they'll have something that actually lasts. But it feels like restaurant interiors are more fleeting than like textile work in any way, because there's a slim chance that a textile could survive, but there's a 0% chance that any part of a restaurant is going to survive. It's going to get totally like its economics are terrible. And and then the food itself, I think, was straining to be as wacky as the interior, because it was like, we're eclectic. We've got French, Mexican, Asian stuff. And I read one of the few stuff you can find online is like reviews of the restaurant food itself, which only makes like passing mention to how zany the interior is. But they had a lot of Hungarian food on there, which makes sense. For Gabor Chupo.
Yeah. And I think the name of the restaurant is very evocative of the darker version of Whimsicraft, Lumpy. That the imperfections you find in that aesthetic are elicited with the name.
Yeah. It's apparently a Frank Zappa song, who Gabor loved, and claims that that's how he learned English, was by listening to Frank Zappa songs, which is an insane way to learn the language.
And then did you want to talk about the factory building in NYC?
Yeah, so the factory, this one it's an old, disused warehouse, is what was its use prior to this. And then particular, architect and artists basically came in and then renovated every single common space to be like as wild as possible. It was converted from industrial to office, and some of the stuff in there is just absolutely wild. I still don't know exactly the cost of it, but they had elevators painted with like chomping teeth doors, kind of huge metal flying like flower. I don't know, like a twisted version of it. Again, it falls much on that like darker side of the Whimsicraft look, where it's almost sort of terrifying look. They
cut apart a school bus and assembled it into like a slug into a hand kind of thing. But it's crazy. And I think just even back then, converting from industrial to office was crazy in itself. That was just before we did that. We purpose-built offices. That's the new, clean, modern, post-war way. And then so revisiting these kind of neglected industrial spaces was, I guess they already felt like they were doing something crazy. They might as well tear apart a school bus and weld it back together.
I feel like it has something to do with definitely that was the time where the 90s has a particular like fascination. It was going on before the 90s, but like the trend of loft conversions and everything like that, and the industrial aesthetic becoming popular, obviously like started, I think, in like, didn't start specifically in New York, but New York was very prominent, like Dumbo in New York, and like artist lofts, the artists moving into these disused spaces and then converting them, and that becoming, a popular style to sort of emulate. And you would see it pop up in a lot in like 1980s movies as like, the cool, hip, young, like even the yuppie kind of person would be living in this like converted high loft space. And it's like Soho or something.
The
like
movie
that.
FX is very forgotten. It's an action movie that centers around a guy who does movie effects. And he's framed for murder or something, but he lives in the coolest like New York City loft with like, double height ceilings. And it's like a hard loft where you have exposed brick everywhere and no real creature comforts. But and then seeing it used in this kind of like office space setting. I use the word office space, but I'm about to talk about the movie Office Space. The 90s is when this like kind of horror set in about like office life. And I think this is the beginnings of that kind of what we'd see later with startups like Google and stuff of being like, no, the office is fun. Like, look what we did to a school bus. Like, this is a fun place. We have slides.
It's definitely part of that wave, because I find so many of those. Like there's like that era of like the .com boom, and it's like everyone's going crazy with offices, like foosball tables, and like again like slides, and we're gonna make everything like wacky.
Of the perk wars, as they call it.
But this one, because this I think is sort of part of that wave of like, let's make the workplace like a more fun, colorful thing, get rid of like the endless cubicle farm. And because I did find it interesting that, you would think with this like very quirky and even sort of like disturbing, like some of the like it's like very, it's a lot to take in like at this space. But then you look at like the directory of it, and I mean, like I noticed a name and I even recognized on there, it's Nuveen, it's Nuveen Investments, which is this like huge, massive asset management company.
It's the most boring service in the world.
Which I was like, can that be right? Like, no way. Like, they're in this building. Like, it's just imagining this like super like uptight business person.
Humdrum thing.
Yeah, and walking through the chomping elevator doors to go to this. But I think there was something about that interplay between like, corporate appropriation of Whimsicraft or something, this aesthetic, and like to make yourself, like appear more.
Yeah, it's
hipper.
like the corporate thing to be like, A, we're fun, B, we support the arts. We're not just squares. Like, yes, we just make our money by moving numbers around and all that, but actually we're in the tradition of like moving forward the arts.
Yeah. And on fun, one place I think really exemplifies the Whimsicraft aesthetic and ethos is the City Museum in St. Louis. So it's this giant 600,000 square foot factory that then got converted into a quote unquote museum, but it's really not a museum. It's a giant playground for both children and adults. Mm-hmm. The first floor, especially, they put a lot of work into it. There's a lot of pictures of it on the Pinterest board, but you find things like broken tile ceramics, things hanging from the ceiling, fabric that really make me think of that scene from Harriet the Spy. But again, it just really fits that ethos of like getting people off their feet, engaging with art by physically climbing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I was saying that I want something that like lasts physically, and I guess this is as close as we might get. Like a place semi-unupdated from 1997. I'm sure they've added new stuff. They probably haven't changed that like main entry stuff.
Yeah,
all
and
the
it's
slides.
Huge. I went there this summer. I went with someone who wasn't that jazzed about it, so I left kind of early. So I didn't feel like I even got to see a quarter of what was in there. But I remember like on the fourth floor, I got to what was this giant staircase that skipped many floors and then went to the roof. And on the roof, they have things like a school bus, a Ferris wheel. You commented it looked a bit utopian scholastic up there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it does have that kind of element where you're taking like well-known iconography or something like that and then like placing it randomly out there to like create this like
the columns on its side.
Like out of time, or here's like, I don't know. But that does, because it reminds me of like what we spoke about earlier about like the 90s was sort of interested in having like kids having their own little worlds or something like that. There's like this particular fascination with, because I know at the time, like also there was absolutely, I feel like there's an article on this, a proliferation of like kids science centers, kids museums.
Okay, I'm not going crazy.
Like, it seemed like there was just everywhere at the time. Like they would, or even just like kids, Discovery Zone or something. That's kind of more on like a certain other side of it, but like making sure there are plenty of whimsical places for kids or something in the environment.
Yeah, that was something it felt like everywhere I lived in like Phoenix and Las Vegas growing up as a kid, and then also lived in Germany, but it felt like there was always a newly opened kids museum. There a new children's wing just got expanded on the library. It felt like things were more kid oriented than ever. We weren't the baby boomer, proportionally, like we weren't a gigantic demographic cohort, but it felt like more and more of the world was being pivoted towards us at that time.
It was the peak of the phrase "children are our future."
Yeah, maybe.
Well, there was actually funnily enough, like before millennials were called millennials, or they're called like Gen Y or whatever. But before that, they were called echo boomers.
Oh,
because there actually was like
the kids of boomers, so that's generally going to be a pretty large generation.
True, yeah. There was like a major like uptick in like births or something from like 1987 to 1992. So we were actually we were like a pretty large like little mini baby boom or something like that around that time. Which I do wonder if that has something to do with the emphasis on, because I felt like there was like an emphasis on babies and kids, and like I don't know, that's totally like anecdotal or something.
No.
Baby media in the early 90s, kids media in the mid 90s. I don't know. Something grew up with us.
We try and put ourselves like in a higher perspective and look at like, just because I was a child then doesn't mean that everyone else was a child then. But we had an episode about fast food, and in researching them, I realized like, as a child, I remember McDonald's being so child focused, but nowadays it seems like it's not. But that's just because I've grown up. But no, they did change their focus. Like they were more focused on selling to kids in that period, more than any period before or after that. And so I think there was kind of a kids world with a science twist as well. Mm-hmm. There was just kind of a get kids involved in art and science. There was this idea of the child as a fertile mind that needs constant development.
Yeah. I wonder if that had something like the reasoning why like adults, I mean, this is like totally just guessing at things, but like the idea that there were so many kids around at that time or something, and you have the adults and the parents like in the environment and everything, like trying to make it a more fun, whimsical, like make it more wacky, make it more whimsical or something like that, like just to have the like kind of, maybe it filtered into that like just general design ethos of the time. Because I do notice that like even outside of kids' spaces, there was like this bizarre filtering of like wacky imagery and iconography into adult media.
Yeah.
Which is very sort of strange to think about now because things are just very not I wouldn't consider them very wacky or whimsical or like
outside of Adult Swim, which I feel like is also less wacky than it used to be in some ways too. Yeah. Like that's kind of why the Lumpy Gravy restaurant interested me so much, because it's one of the few things here that's like fully adult. Like it was not like exactly fine dining, but it wasn't really a place that I don't think you'd like put your kid in a high chair there. I don't think like, and it was again a place made by a guy who's made his money off of children's shows, and he opens a restaurant / gallery space for adults. Like,
I think you're both interpreting a bit differently than me, because this aesthetic, it was created for and proliferated by the zany ant, the childless ant in the family.
The childless ant.
And yeah, I don't think there are a lot of examples on the Pinterest board of things from like childhood. Like I don't see any children's toys. I think the City Museum is a good example I happen to think of, but I don't know.
Could be veering off a little bit into scholastic utopia.
Or Wacky Pomo. Which is another one.
Wacky Pomo.
That's a huge, that one, because these do exist in like a little realm where they relate to each other. But it's true that, that one, Wacky Pomo is certainly more like, it's cleaner, and also it's very corporate because it's like corporate advertising to kids. I mean, there's like an aspect it was pulling from something, like kind of a Pee-wee's Playhouse type thing, but it got very corporate for sure. And that does differ from
Whimsicraft. Something I included on the docket but wrote out was, when I was first thinking about this aesthetic before I really got a real understanding of it, because we're the first ones really to do an expose on Whimsicraft. Other than us, there's been a 1 minute long TikTok video that went viral. That's good. I did like that, but we're the first ones to really analyze this. So we really had to try to get it right. And so I was thinking about children's books, and I was like, does like the old lady who swallowed a fly fit in because the colors are kind of similar, and like no, but I do actually think there might be some children's books out there with a found object look. I'm not a children's librarian, but I bet there's something out there that really fits.
What's the aesthetic for the Stinky Cheese Man? We were wondering this.
You were going to say that, and you were going to say people always bring up the Stinky Cheese Man.
Many are asking me this.
I have been.
People stop me on the street and they say,
we have like a term. We almost have a term in CARI called like the Stinky Cheese Man dilemma, because we cannot figure out where to place it. We've had so much trouble trying to like.
Is it related to Shrek?
Wait, Shrek came from a children's book. Actually, I was working in my last branch, and I don't do this often, but I was doing the pick list, and I picked up Shrek off the shelf. And it was this 90s book, and I was like, wait, this was the inspiration for the movie? But yeah, I actually emailed Evan Joseph. I sent him an email where I was like, does this Stinky Cheese Man fit?
I love it, like in Gmail, no professional heading.
We do have, I think it's by an artist called Lane Smith. He has a very distinct style. I hope I'm right on that. But we technically have that one. It gets in one of those like emerging ones that I've been working on. That is like still
like on bated breath.
Like, be careful.
Where does he go?
But in a way, it's already technically established. If you go on Wikipedia and you search lowbrow art or pop surrealism, possibly it fits under there. I don't know, because I mean, I've been looking more into like that is an established style, like lowbrow, which is a term kind of describing this particular sort of surrealist art, but inspired by like pulp, kitsch, kind of that kind of thing. That it was very popular and emerged kind of in the 80s and the 90s. Became one of the best examples is you'll know it when you see it for sure. Mark Ryden illustrations, the weird, creepy Victorian, like I don't know, children look or something like that. It's been used a billion times, like Alice in Wonder. It's sort of an Alice in Wonderland kind of thing.
Oh,
This
stuff, I know that. It's
very popular in like 90s rock musician album covers, oddly enough. But yeah, it's this idea of like a general.
He looks like I would hope he would look as a guy.
But yeah, it's like I'm sorry, it's on a tangent. Is that okay? But
no, that's fine. I feel like this kind of looks a bit like Mackenzie Childs in a way.
There is a whole little world of like pastelified Victoriana type stuff that is also going on that gets into something totally different. But yeah, there's like a different style for that. But
I have to resist the urge to just like name intellectual properties and be like, what category is that? I need to not use you as just like a website, basically.
Yeah. And then I think like maybe the end of Whimsicraft was the event Cows on Parade. This is called Cow Parade in other cities, but in Chicago, where it first started in 1999, the event was called Cows on Parade. And It was the idea of the then lead of the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events, Lois Weisberg. She's honored with a giant bronze cast of one of the cows in front of the cultural center, which is where DCASE has their offices to this day. But Cows on Parade, it was a really successful event. You listed they put 6,000 cows in the city.
Yeah.
It was that many?
It's a huge amount of bronze when you think about it.
Well, it wasn't bronze. There was one bronze cast, but the others were fiberglass.
Fiberglass.
Yeah.
Yes. Still, tremendous amount.
Yeah. But I'm going to put a link to a video that I found on YouTube of the original event in 1999. And the cows have such saturated colors. They're hand painted a lot of the time. Yeah. Did you look through that? Don't they fit?
Yeah, no, I took a look at some of them, and I definitely do think it's got the patterns and like the colors. Yeah, I feel like that would fit. I feel like that does sort of follow.
So it was like fiberglass. I wasn't in Chicago in this period, but they were placed all over the city.
I think a lot of them were along the Magnificent Mile, so Michigan Avenue, where a lot of the tourists go. But this event was so successful. That's why I think it's like a really nice endpoint for Whimsicraft, because all the cows were bought and paid for already. Like they got institutions to sponsor them, but then they were auctioned. And the auction in 1999, it fetched $3 million. They were expecting, I think, 300,000, but then it was $2 million for the physical auction and then $1 million online, which is crazy to think about. Wow. But yeah, it was successful in every way. They got people to care about the cows. They cared about art. They went out and they watched them, or they went out and they saw them. And then they made all of this money. So it's just it just showed that people could care about arts and crafts in this way that rarely happens in the art world.
Yeah. You kind of do it by meeting people where they are. Yes, physically, just putting the art out there, but also the fact that it is kind of kitschy and fun. Like the cow itself, I feel is a perfect, they show up in Whimsicraft stuff. I just see cows generally, the spots too, the organic shapes.
Yeah, the cow jumping over the moon, the children's story, I think elicits whimsy feelings.
Yeah, definitely. And in that little town I lived close to in Germany when I was a kid in Kaiserslautern, we had 200 fish everywhere because that was to celebrate the 1700th anniversary of this little town. And so the idea originally for the cows is, like many good art ideas, stolen. And it's stolen from Switzerland, did it, because they would actually, I guess for some reason, parade real cows through the town of Zurich, the city of Zurich at some point. But the cow was even more fun for Chicago because we have the legend of Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicking over the lantern and starting the fire. And we also have the meatpacking district. There's also, if you look up the Chicago Cow Path, there was this weird exemption in Chicago zoning where they had to keep space clear for cows to go through well through the 1920s when it was a sprawling metropolis. But yes, there's a lot of cow Chicago angles. So it's fun. It's pop art at its best, I think.
Yeah. And I have fond memories of going downtown to see the cows as a little kid, and many other cities replicated the event. Did you ever do that as a kid?
I've never heard of that. Yeah.
You never heard of it?
No, I never.
Oh.
Well, I grew up really in it wasn't really, we call it the boonies of suburban Virginia.
Okay.
Yeah. We lived pretty far away from most other people, so there wasn't wasn't much of a community. Yeah, it wasn't much community sense, unfortunately.
Places would just try and pick an animal that was semi-relevant to them, cast it in fiberglass, and then shoot it all around the city.
Yeah, no, that people try to replicate the success of this event for a long time. Even Edgewater, they put out 20 lighthouses around 2013 or something. Even neighborhoods were trying to recreate the hype that happened from this. But yeah, that's a nice happy ending for Whimsicraft. But thank you for talking about this with us. Again, I think it was kind of challenging because we're the first ones to really analyze this aesthetic.
Yeah, I feel like we've even hashed out some new things about the aesthetic just through this particular discussion has been really helpful for hammering down certain details and things like that, and bringing new examples to the table is super helpful.
Yeah, I'm glad I was able to contribute some, because initially I had to rely on all of your scans. You have this arena page with 150 pictures, and then I managed to eke out maybe 10 or 15 where I was okay, I found these and I'm pretty sure they fit.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to sit through a magazine at the library and have to go thousands of pages of this stuff just to find anything interesting. Sometimes it can be time consuming for sure.
Yeah. So do you want to conclude with any other ways to promote yourself, social media pages, that kind of thing?
I was on the Twitter X, whatever. But I'm trying to migrate off of there. I have a personal account, Evan Collins. I think it's just Evan Collins at Blue Sky.
Yes.
So I'm going to try to restart all over again on there. Nice. We have our central CARI website, just CARI.institute, and that's our core kind of public-facing presentation website to see kind of all of our polished work, everything. We try to make it really important aspect of it is making sure everything's properly credited. So, on our main public-facing site, we are a little bit kind of overextended at the moment with some of the work that we've been kind of doing. So we're not as active on social media. I am still active on my Tumblr. I'll never give it up. I love Tumblr.
Nice.
Yeah, it pretty much started on Tumblr, and it is still my favorite platform. It is the best way to do that. But other than that, we are sometimes on Instagram, sometimes very rarely active, but I'm very, very active on Arena, and it's kind of tough to find it because I don't have an easy link to it, but I think you probably can put it in the
I'll link it
portion. But that is where pretty much all of my work in progress is being shown on there. Outside of the Discord, which is just closed at the moment, just to keep.
How do people join your Discord? Because I actually would like to join now.
I can make that happen. It's just we've had to just kind of keep everything a little bit like on lock, not lockdown, but like just to.
No, Discords can go sideways. Definitely, you gotta be smart about it.
No, I think gatekeeping can be good. I think it's a good thing.
It's a good thing. Yeah.
For sure.
Well, thank you for coming. You came all the way to Chicago to do this with us, and we had a great time.
Yeah,
I had a great time too.
Okay, fun. Cool. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.